Part 2, materials matter. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the materials of texts matter. This is my bread and butter, and so if this one runs a little bit long, you should just know that at the end are really cool, pretty pictures of medieval manuscripts that you can kind of fast forward through, and then just pick up the last couple things I say about the evolution of print. So if this goes a little long, you have my permission to fast forward once we just start looking at pretty pictures of manuscripts. Okay, but they are very cool. So how the material, this section is about how materiality matters. You cannot carry Gilgamesh. It is not portable. This particular tablet is one of 11, and that is what remains. We know for sure that there were more, and these are just the fragments that we have. So the original, or the unified text that you might read in a Penguin Classic, for example, the first half of it is relatively continuous because we have most of those tablets. And then later on, you get into a couple of other episodes that are not connected, and you're not really clear on the relationship of one to the other, except that Gilgamesh is in them. And those tablets are even more fragmentary. And so we know that we're missing pieces, and you just simply could not have put that text in any kind of portable format. So this is a monumental text, which means it is made to preserve the text, but not necessarily to be read by people, and certainly not to be read, at home in your leisure time, because you can't take that home, and you definitely can't take that, to bed for night reading. So it's not surprising that cultures developed more portable forms of media, right? So we're looking here at our scrolls, our bamboo slip scrolls or rolls. That was one way of trying to roll up or trying to transport a rigid medium, is cut it into small enough pieces that it can be rolled, and then that can be transported. But that's still a pretty bulky way of transporting a relatively limited amount of information. And so it's not hard to see how we got from the rigid scroll to the flexible scroll. This happens to be the oldest complete Torah in the world, but scrolls are really good for media that can become rigid, including papyrus, because papyrus does not hold up under the conditions of, the conditions of binding. Papyrus would break if you tried to make pages, right? Let's paint samples. Yep, I am in the workshop. And I didn't bring a piece of paper with me to show you quires, so I will do a separate video on that. Anyhow, so this is this, and then binding it, right, to make a book, is not something that you could do with papyrus, because the puncturing of the papyrus would lead to its quicker disintegration. And so papyrus has to be rolled. The downside, if you remember that image a couple slides back of those decaying Dead Sea Scrolls, this is also a Dead Sea Scroll. The downside is that papyrus dries out, and when it does, it becomes extremely rigid, and it's very difficult to unroll it. So actually, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, rather than trying to unroll them, like this one is being unrolled to read them, instead, what you get are scrolls that were unreadable until very, very recently, in which modern technology used a lot of optical data collection tools to scan the writing inside the roll and reconstruct it without actually having to unroll it. So one of the ways that we can read dried out papyrus scrolls is with some heavy technology. But if we're talking about the transmission of cultures to people before the invention of, X-ray spectroscopy, this isn't going to be the longest lasting form of media, which is why the invention of parchment was really important. It was invented somewhere in the Mediterranean. We know that writing on animal skins was already in existence. Writing on leather certainly was happening in Egypt. We do not have examples of that, not very many anyway, but we have written texts about it. And so we know it was happening, but we don't have examples because leather does not last. Parchment, on the other hand, becomes a really important innovation on that system. So before we get a sense of that, I just want to make sure that we're clear. We're talking about much farther in the future than any of us has been discussing this far. So what we're going to do in this lecture is kind of speed ahead and fast forward a little bit and get a sense of how this worked over the long trajectory of media history, which means we also have to acknowledge this moment of history that we are going to come back to in lectures, but this is Hellenism, which is a result of the conquest of Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander's empire literally only lasted as long as he was alive, but one of the legacies of that was that it brought all of these different cultures into contact, and they all started to use the same language, mostly Greek, to interact with each other, and they generated a period of relative cultural tolerance, right? So you have a lot of different kinds of folks here, a lot of different cultures, a lot of different languages, but they interacted and exchanged trade and ideas, and that created a very rich moment of cultural exchange. So that's Hellenism. So parchment comes out of Hellenism. We're not exactly sure when it was developed, but we know that Pergamon in what is now Turkey became the kind of became the kind of mega center of parchment production, largely because we think reeds had been over harvested in other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's what people were writing on, was papyrus. And so the papyrus reeds were just not producing enough. And so this medium of parchment was already in use, and definitely a lot at Pergamon. But then suddenly when the reeds become less available, parchment becomes more desirable, right? So that's what we know about the origins of parchment. We have no idea who invented it, how or why, or where this idea came from, but it's a totally different treatment of animal skins, and this is the gross part, and don't fast forward through this because I love this part. But also, there's some science. So if you're a sciencey person, hang in there with me. So first, your animal skins are soaked in a lye bath, and that has strong chemical consequences. The main thing that's important here is that it loosens the flesh and hair from the skin so that it can then be scraped off, right? So it's put over some kind of round barrel shape, and then these like long, slightly curved knives are used to scrape the bits off of both sides, right? So on the one side, you see this is obviously a hair side. This looks like it's going to be a cow, probably a calf skin. Fully grown cows make leather. Their skins are too thick to make parchment. So parchment is made out of calf, sheep, and goat skin primarily, but it can certainly be made out of other animals. And then this is the flesh side, which means the side with all the like fat and muscle tissue that's still stuck to it. See, I told you I liked grossing students out. And then once those are scraped, they're hung. If you're not ready to stretch them, then they can dry in this position, and they basically are rawhide. That's literally raw hide. But then they can be soaked and re-prepared. Oh, poor Jesse. His picture is degrading as I move it from slideshow to slideshow. Anyhow, so this apparatus is called a drum. Ha! Wow, what a concept. Literal drums were made from stretching animal skins over the tops of the frame, and then that created an instrument. So in this case, the drum is a tool rather than an instrument, and it is used to stretch out that animal skin. And then while it is on the drum, you take the lunellum, that's that curved knife, and with a lot of body weight, like a lot of body weight, you lean into that and you scrape that down as thin as possible. And then that's going to stretch it out. And then you turn the little toggles on your drum and you go again and you go again until it has like reached maximum stretching point, which you generally get a sense of because it starts, you start to find little tiny holes in it and you're like, okay, I have to stop. This is Jesse Meyer in the center. He is currently the proprietor of Pergamon, which is a leather and parchment shop that has been working in leather and parchment since 1550 in his family, right? This has been his family's business since the end of the Middle Ages. And when they emigrated from Germany to upstate New York, they brought the tannery parchment making business with them. So Jesse gives lots of workshops to medieval material nerds. So then once it is stretched to its max, and you can really kind of see how we get a sense of its max, because look, there it is. We started to get that hole towards the edge. We know it's at its limit. Then we leave it to dry. And it's interesting because when you look at these pieces, you can really see the animality of them, right? This is a skin. Here, this is going to be the butt on this animal, and these are its legs, and these would be its shoulders, and right up here would be its neck. There are some pieces where the neck is like more visible, and you can see that the edges here have a kind of rawhidey translucency, and that's just a part of the process. The fat towards the edges and the grease, it kind of moves out of this middle, which gives us this nice, clear, white surface, not white, but it, whitish surface. So these edges are garbage. They're not really worth writing on. And you can also see this is the mark of the spine on this parchment hide. So if you're making a really big book, you would cut a big rectangle out of the middle like this. Boop, 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 boop. And then you would fold that in half. That's called a bifolium. And this literally would have been, the fold would have been along the spine of the animal. And then you have another one that's along the spine of another animal. And you line them up. And you have another one that's along the spine of that animal. And you line them up. And then you bind them together. And then this becomes, the spine of a book, right? So like the spine of a book is like the literal spines of animals. Anyhow, when this parchment is ready, it gets trimmed out, right? You don't detach it. You cut it out, and then you loosen the toggles on the drum. Once it is cut out, then you finish it by hand. So these are some folks in a workshop who are finishing a piece of raw parchment that I brought to a workshop at NYU from Jesse. So Jesse provided us with raw parchment, and we finished it and wrote on it and made a manuscript out of it. So you have to sand it first. The more you sand, the softer it gets. So there are grades of parchment. The stuff that is not very soft has not been worked very long in this process. The stuff that is really soft and luxurious and almost feels like suede has been sanded to, well, I would say to death, but it's already dead, has been worked much more extensively and is therefore more costly in labor, which is why it is a luxury object. So parchment can be used to make scrolls, and it certainly was, but then it can also be used to do the thing that we could not do with the plant-based supports before. So even in like Mesoamerica, when they were creating books out of their plant-based paper, they had to create them different. They did not use the codex. That's what this is called, codex. It sounds like a really cool and fancy word. It isn't. A codex simply refers to, here, I'm gonna invert these, right? Oh wait, these are both white. So that's helpful. Let's assume these are regular parchment surfaces. These are my pages, my folios. And then I'm going to have my pages inside. And then on the outside, I'm going to put some kind of protective cover. So a codex is literally just pages of content bound inside a protective cover, right? That is the key invention here that makes parchment so useful. And in terms of like the Maya codices, they actually can't bind them in the same way. And so they end up being one long strip of paper, just like a scroll, but instead of being rolled, they are bound by sort of folding back on one another, like an accordion fold. And that means that they only have to bind two pieces together, and that preserves the paper. Unlike a Western book-shaped codex, that becomes a very different object. I was looking around to see if there's a sample of a book in here. I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's like a woodworker's magazine, but I think you get the idea. Where did the idea for the codex come from? It appears to be based in the wax writing tablet. So this is another temporary form of writing used to like take notes. If you were going to the Lyceum and listening to Plato or Aristotle lecture, you might take notes on the things that they say in your little wax tablet, and then you hang on to it. You close it up, so it's a codex too in a form. On the inside, there's one surface of wax and the other surface of wax, and on the outside, it's wood. And so that protects your writing for as long as you want to preserve it. And then once you've got it memorized, which is literally what the tablet is here for, is to help you memorize stuff, then you can open your tablet back up and you can smush out that wax. That's actually what the other end of the stylus is for. This is for smushing it out. This is for the writing, and this is for the erasing. And voila, you have portable text, but temporary text. So one of the innovations of the wax tablet was adding pages, right? Adding surfaces to the tablet so that you could keep more at once without necessarily making it much bigger or less portable. And so now we have this is our original tablet, and then we have an extra layer of tablets with writing surfaces on both sides put in the middle, and voila, you now have 6 writable surfaces protected by 2 external covers. And voila, we have the origins of the book form. So then when somebody's like, wait, but we could do this with parchment, and we could do it with hundreds of pieces instead of just 4. Then we have the book. Parchment makes it possible to add more layers because it has 2 qualities. It is both thin and supple. Right, well, okay. It has the material quality of being thin and supple while also being quite strong. So one of the things that happens, and I forgot to mention it during this phase, is that the lye bath that this was soaked in actually loosened all of the weak bonds between the collagen molecules and the animal skin. Excuse me. And so animal skins, I should have included a picture of this. I don't know why I didn't. I have like my own pictures of this. With a Princeton instrument spectrometer. But anyway, imaging spectrometer. So the collagen fibers, they sort of like make a jumble, right? They're like, ugh. Exactly like that. Ugh. Anyway, they're all jumbled up. And then the weak bonds that kind of attach them in this weird way, they get dissolved. And then in this scraping and stretching process, those collagen fibers get like lined up like this. And that then gives them an opportunity. So while they're wet, they're just kind of like generally stretching and lining up this way. And then as they dry, they start to form bonds this way. And they become extremely strong, like extremely strong. So the second quality of parchment is not only is it like thin and flexible, but it is also super strong, which makes it really good for doing this, right? So we have our strong and flexible parchment, and that becomes the basis of copying. All right, I feel like I really do have to do this, so I have to find myself something that can substitute for paper. I really am working from within a wood shop, aren't I? Voila, our finished piece of parchment. This gets copied as a whole piece, and that's what you're looking at here in this scriptorium picture, because the way that the book is made is by folding it. right? So let's assume that was the spine. So you make your first fold this way. And if this is your whole book, you're making a very big book, and voila, and it's made out of bifolia, and we talked about how that worked with the paint samples. It's going to be the weirdest version of this lecture I've ever done. And then if you fold it again, now you have a binding along here. And if you trim this top off, now you have a 4-leaf book, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves, which makes 8 pages. Now most books were actually folded one more time. This is called a quarto. And this is a quattrocento, or a quire, as it is later called. And there will be a better demonstration of this if you choose to make a quire for your activity this week. But the point here is that now, right, if you bind, so you would sew right along in here, you would sew this piece. That's called the sewing. What a weird term. And then this becomes your little booklet. And this booklet has 8 leaves, which means 16 pages. And this is generally the standard form of the book. But what that means when you copy it is that you don't get to like copy it all in order, right? Like page 1 is over here, and page 2 is like over here. And then the back side of this is going to be page 16. No, like the back side of whatever, right? These do not go in order. It's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's not how that goes. So you have to know exactly where each of these little fold pieces will land in order to lay this out flat and copy it, which is what you see these medieval monks and nuns doing here, right? So this is a highly, highly skilled work. And when people get it wrong, it really messes up the book, because they get it wrong. And one of the cool things about parchment, one of the things that I think is very cool about parchment is the animality of it. It's very, very clear when you look at parchment that it is not a blank surface for writing on. It is an animal. You can see that in some of the weird, quirky things that happen. So for example, in this center image, you can see a lot of these like dots, these pigmented dots. Those are actually the places where the hair follicles were located in the skin. So we are looking at the hair side of this piece. And then there's a hole in the hair side. And now that's a pretty small hole. So that was actually probably a bug bite. So like a blemish on the animal's skin when it died. And then in the process of stretching, that becomes a weak point and it makes a hole. Some holes, like this one, were probably hunting wounds, right? And then some, that's not even a hole, but like some cuts were probably accidents in the production of parchment. But the parchment is so valuable that you don't throw it away because it's got a hole or a cut in it. You fix it. Or in some cases you use it and decorate it. Like this is a particularly interesting little crochet fix to this. And what that does is that makes sure that this hole does not become a weak spot in this page. It doesn't allow for more ripping and tearing, but it also is an opportunity for sometimes clever arrangement, right? A little dragon poking through here. Here we've got a little critter around this hole to just kind of like take up that space. And sometimes it's a little more utilitarian. It's just a repair to make sure that it doesn't continue to rip or stretch. And the repair is often made on the drum so that it can keep that from stretching out too far while it's being dried. So medieval books. Remember at the part I said about the pretty pictures? If you have to fast forward through this, I will understand. But one of the things that's really important for us to remember is that just because it is a book doesn't mean that it works the same way that our modern printed books work. They're not just containers for text. Oh, you know what I just realized? I didn't include any treasure bindings. I will post a picture of a medieval treasure binding because holy shit. If you think this is elaborate, imagine the face of this book encrusted with jewels, like for real, encrusted with jewels. So this is a super, super elaborate object. It's called the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the only four things that it contains are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's it. That's all there is. It's a huge book, and it is super decorated. Not every page looks this way, but the beginning of each gospel has a carpet page with intricate Celtic knotwork. And then it has this, which is like the opening page, right? So the Liber Generationis Jesu Christi, and then it goes blah, 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 right? This is the book of the generations of Jesus. And so we start with the genealogy of Jesus in Matthäus. This is super detailed. This book is about this big, and so when you open it, it's about this big. And look at this, just down and down, super intricate and detailed. Right? This is not simply a container, a utilitarian container for text. This is another object altogether. This is it's the Latrell Psalter. This is another fun one. What is happening? The text here is the Psalms, but the margins are something very, very, very different. Shit gets even weirder in this book, I will say. And then there's these. And these. And my favorite book. This is literally my favorite book in the whole world. This is the Book of Hours of Catherine of Cleves. So this is her prayer book. Here's Catherine, right? And one of the key things here that I want to mention, even though we are not talking about the Middle Ages, but medieval art is often depicted as rudimentary because it's not realistic. But medieval art's relationships are symbolic rather than the relationships of realism, which is the depiction of things as the human eye perceives them. This is a prime example of symbolic representation, right? The Virgin Mary is in the center. She is bigger than Catherine, and she is surrounded by gold, right? And she is enshrined on this little altar. And then Catherine is over here on the side in a prayerful position, much smaller. And she is only linked to Mary by a couple of things. Her dress links her to Mary, so she shares in her womanhood. This is her actually holding her little prayer book. Her prayer book, her devotion, this object, links her to Mary because this is the little office of the Virgin, which is a set of prayers that are said at specific hours of the day, every day. And then there's this scroll, which is the prayer itself, ascending to heaven and crossing over into that Marian realm in the hopes of Marian intervention on her behalf. Now, what's interesting about Catherine is she clearly doesn't think that little of herself because she's actually not that much smaller than Mary. And some people in their books of hours are much smaller. Some people are not pictured in their books of hours at all. So symbolic relationships are the key to medieval art forms, not realistic representation. But here's my favorite thing about the Hours of Catherine of Cleves. This is the opening prayer. No, I know we're not there yet, but I'm going to set it up. This is the opening for the prayer of the Office of the Dead. Yep. So vigil, which is the evening hours, often included the prayers of the Office of the Dead. And it was a kind of daily reminder that we're all going to die. Post-plague medieval Europe was very morbid. And so what would you want at the beginning of the Office of the Dead? Well, of course you would want the Castle of Hell and its terrifying gaping hellmouth. Duh. This book is like this big. It's fat. It's a fat little book. But like, oh my God, this painting is so detailed that some of these little lines in the middle are done with a single hairbrush. Single hair, right? Like tiny. If you happened to notice, the mouth of hell is kind of a gaping pussycat. We'll put it that way, right? Pun intended. Yes, there's a thing going on there, and that it could be dissected forever, and I would love to do it, but we don't have 4 hours. So it's not until the late Middle Ages that medieval books, that European books, start to use paper, which they do start to do. But as you can see, right, you can see the mesh strainer. You can even see the watermark that's built into the mesh, and then it gets like built in essentially to the paper because the pulp forms around it. But you can see the grain of this paper. It's not a very good picture, but it's the best picture I have with grain. And then what happens is you bind it the same way, but paper, like we talked about, is just not as durable as parchment. So this is a much newer book than like this one. This one is in great shape. This one, not so much. And so in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, when paper starts to become a thing in Europe, it goes from China through the Islamic world. So it goes through Persia and then through the Islamic Caliphate. And then from the Islamic Caliphate, it moves up into Europe through the Iberian Peninsula. And you start to get paper mills in Italy around 1250, but paper doesn't really become a popular medium for books until it is so dirt cheap that the consideration of like, oh, parchment is more expensive, but it's more durable, and like paper is cheap, right? Generally, the lack of durability on the paper is such a problem that the cheapness doesn't offset it. Right? It's not until it becomes so cheap that people are like, well, okay, that kind of outweighs the durability question because I don't need this to last forever. 100 years is good enough. And paper will last several hundred years. Parchment will last not quite forever, but pretty close, because the difference between what's happening on parchment is that the ink, when you apply it to parchment surfaces, the ink actually forms a chemical bond, right? An actual integration with the surface of the parchment skin. So like you're really more tattooing parchment than you are writing on top of it. And to erase anything that you write on parchment, you have to actually just remove the layer of parchment with which the ink has bonded. Now on paper, that's a mechanical bond, which means that they don't integrate, but they kind of like sit on top of each other, right? Which means it's much easier to remove ink from paper. But the other cool thing is that ink is ferrous, right? So it's made from an ionized iron. And what happens is in the parchment, that ink, if it's not super balanced, it will like continue to colonize the page. Like the ink will continue chemically reacting with the page until there are no more loose electrons. And so sometimes you can see that text will rust. It'll have an aura around the text. And that's because the iron is rusting because it was not a very balanced ink. Now, in paper, what that leads to is it just eats through the paper and the words disappear. So parchment literally will outlast. The parchment books that we have will literally outlast everything we ever produce on paper. So 500 or 1,000 years from now, every piece of modern knowledge that we produced on paper books will be gone. All of it. There'll be little fragments of it from, and there'll be like some, 3030 papyrologist, if we are so lucky that humanity survives that long. There'll be some papyrologist at that point who's reconstructing fragments of a comic book, right? Or you'll have a medievalist who'll be like, well, my book is still fine. Right? So all of the knowledge of the Middle Ages is going to still be there, just like cuneiform. But all of the knowledge that we put into printed books is going to decay. So we're going to have this very, very different surviving history of our own media. Which brings us to print. Okay, so if you fast forwarded, stop here, right? Stop. Okay, that was actually used for something different. But so we often end our conversation about the history of the medieval book and the pre-modern forms of cultural transmission by being like, voila, Gutenberg invented the press. That is not what happened. So quick run through. You don't have to remember this in detail. The big takeaway here is that Gutenberg didn't invent shit. What he did was recombine some things that already existed. So Chinese printing was already well in use by the time that Gutenberg got to it in the 1450s. So these are woodcuts, right? So intricate woodcuts, and you could do whole images that you carved it out in relief, and then you pressed the woodcut into ink, and then you pressed it onto your paper. Yes, paper. Or you could do sort of smaller sets of text, or you could do individual characters, right? China had already done that. In the 1450s, we're talking 100 years post Marco Polo, right? Gutenberg is definitely cribbing from China. What he did do is he made some innovations on how to create individual letter die cuts with an alloy that's not going to degrade after pressing it so much. So you're not using wood, and he innovated a tool for how to do that. And he had the brilliant idea, and this actually was a really brilliant idea, of taking this Chinese technology that he's improved by metallizing, and putting it on a wine press. That's literally what you're looking at here, a wine press. And using the wine press to make the print, and to make sure that you get all of the letters pressed evenly onto the surface, which means that you can print bigger areas with more individual dies. So printing becomes a whole new technology. But it is imitating the manuscripts. This is a printed book. Doesn't look that different, does it? Right? Whoop, boop, 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 boop. So the printed book's layout is definitely drawn from the manuscript book, right? The handwritten book. Even the letter forms are designed to imitate Gothic letter forms, which are handwritten. And it's not until after the turn of 1500 that people start to be like, okay, there's got to be easier ways to make these letters easier to carve, easier to read. But at first, they are literally just imitating manuscripts. And they go so far as to not only imitate the form and the layout and the text, but they even, after the book is printed, they bring in hand illustrators to add these margins and these red marks. This is called rubrication, adding these red titles. And these hash marks on our first letters of our sentences. That's medieval punctuation, essentially. Literally, punctuation comes from the word punctus. And you can see, here's a single punctus, a punctum. And here's two punctus. And this combined with this little red hash mark is the sum total of medieval punctuation forms. And there are no rules. None whatsoever. So you just kind of have to roll with the logic of whoever was writing your text. So this is what a medieval book looks like. Now, we're going to pause here to break up this segment. I know that was long. I know I nerded out because this is my jam. But the key thing about this is that a lot of the narratives that we tell about our history of textual transmission are romanticized and oversimplified, and they're done to make somebody the hero, right? Who's the hero of the invention of writing? Well, the ancient Mesopotamians, of course. Who's the hero of the invention of print? Well, Gutenberg, of course. And when we start to really dig under the surface of the materials that were used in these processes, we find that what you have is a much, much, much more complicated endeavor in which whole cultures of people were interacting with each other, were learning from other cultures, and were integrating all of the best technologies that they could find and synthesizing them into a new form. That's what print is, right? It is a synthesis of centuries of textual technology